A bloodthirsty vampire cat. Hours later, another bus delivered the boys to a dimly lit bus stand on the outskirts of Chakrata. It was almost deserted except for the few arrivals who disappeared into the surrounding gloom. A few lights twinkled on the hillside. Tall deodars loomed out of the darkness. Dogs howled. "Why are the dogs howling?" asked Rusty. "They howl when there are evil spirits around," replied Poppet. "That's what my grandmother told me." "She's probably right," mused Rusty. "Dogs bark at people and at other animals. They howl at what they can't see or hear." "This is the end of the earth," said Pitambar, looking about in dismay. "Only the end of the road," said Rusty. "And where do we eat?" asked Pitambar. "It's only 9 o'clock, but everything is shut." "My father gave me an address," said Poppet. The boys hopefully set out in search of it, but were told that it was on the far side of the town. There was no hotel. Then someone told them to try the old forest rest house. No one went there anymore, not since a new one had been built for visiting forest officials. So off they trudged, helped to some extent by a half moon that occasionally appeared between the scurrying clouds. Poppet had wisely brought along a torchlight, but they used it sparingly, knowing the battery wouldn't last too long. Down below in the thick of the forest they saw a faint light, the glow of a lantern standing on a veranda wall. "That must be it!" exclaimed Rusty. They stumbled down a narrow path which led the veranda steps. The rest of the building was in darkness, seemingly unoccupied. In the distance, a dog howled. "This place is full of howling dogs," said Poppet. "I say we go back to Dehra in the morning after I have seen my father's clients." "Let's do some howling too," suggested Rusty. "There must be a chowkidar somewhere." So they began shouting, "Chowkidar! Chowkidar!" And presently another lamp appeared from the rear of the building, moving towards them very slowly, almost as though there was no one behind it. But gradually a figure manifested itself, and the man who held the lamp raised it so that he could see their faces, at the same time revealing his own. It was the face of a one-eyed man. A scar ran down one side of his face. It was hard to tell his age. He may have been 50, he may have been 70. He wore a funny-looking hat. It looked like a bowler hat, something left behind by British officials. "What do you want?" he asked suspiciously, for he was wary of high-spirited students. "Shelter," said Rusty. "Food," said Pitambar at the same time. "Do you have any money?" A little," said Poppet cautiously. "Very little," added Rusty, who didn't like the man's attitude. "All right, you can come in. There is a spare room. Wait until I put on the lights." Finally, there were lights everywhere. The front room had a large dining table in the middle. Then there was a bedroom with 2 double beds and a huge cavernous bathroom with a basin at one end and a potty at the other. And there was a kitchen which looked empty. Pitambar made a quick inspection of the kitchen and discovered some stale chapatis. "You could play table tennis with these," he said. "Probably made in the Emperor Ashoka's time," added Rusty. But the chowkidar promised to rustle up some food, and the boys made themselves at home. Pitambar did some exercises. Poppet studied a small notebook and made some calculations. Rusty stared out of the window into the night. The light of the half moon played upon the trees and bushes opposite the clearing. A large black cat emerged from the shrubbery and crept towards the rest house. The kitchen light gave promise of a meal. The caretaker cum cook cum chowkidar came up with a quite decent meal, a vegetable curry, dal and lots of hot chapatis, and watched them as they tore into the food. "And where is your journey taking you?" he asked. "It is not yet the trekking season." To the top of the Witch Mountain, said Rusty. Ah, but no one goes there anymore. There are only a few ruins there now. No one lives on the mountain. Although many years ago it was the home of kings and queens. Sometimes people wander up there and don't come back. They go looking for a treasure that doesn't exist. We'll come back, said Poppet. We have to. I have an exam to take. And there is a wrestling tournament coming up, said Pitambar. 5,000 rupees if I win all my bouts. They went to bed early. Pitambar took over one of the beds while Rusty and Poppet shared the other. They had barely settled down when they felt a slight tremor. Then all the lights went out. Did you feel that? Asked Poppet. The bed shook a little, said Rusty. Could it be an earthquake? Maybe it's just Pitambar moving around, Poppet chortled. But soon there was another tremor, more distinct than the first, and all the window panes began rattling. Rusty and Poppet jumped out of bed. It is an earthquake, exclaimed Rusty, but there were no further tremors, and presently Rusty and Poppet returned to their bed. Pitambar was fast asleep. The mild earthquake had not bothered him. They lived in a region that was prone to such tremors, and there were tales of an extinct volcano that sometimes showed signs of activity. Rusty slept soundly till about midnight, when he was woken by someone or something scratching on the window panes. The window was locked, and at first he assumed that the scratching was caused by the cat he had seen earlier that evening, but the sound continued, scratch, scratch, scratch. And finally Rusty got up and reached for the light switch, only to find that all the lights had gone, probably because of the earthquake. So he went to the window and peered through the glasses. At first he saw nothing. Then he made out the shape of the black cat he had earlier seen. Feeling sorry for it, he opened the window and it darted into the room, purring softly. Rusty returned to his bed and the cat followed him, curling up near his feet. He was not particularly fond of cats, and his first impulse was to push it off the bed. And then he thought, it's probably used to sleeping in this room. I'll let it be, as long as it doesn't trouble Poppet or start chasing rats. But all it did was come a little closer, advancing from Rusty's feet to his knees, and purring loudly, as though quite satisfied with the situation. Lulled by the purring of the cat, Rusty fell asleep. He slept for a couple of hours before he was awakened by a feeling of wetness under his right armpit. His vest was wet, and something was sucking away at his flesh. It was with a feeling of horror that he discovered that the cat was now stretched out beside him, and it was licking away at his bleeding armpit with a certain amount of relish, and the purring was louder than ever. A blood-sucking cat? Rusty sat up on the bed, flung the cat away from him, sent Poppet rolling to the floor, and made a dash for the light switch. As the light came up, Rusty saw the cat standing at the foot of the bed, tail erect and hair on end. It looked very angry, and then for the space of 5 seconds at the most, its appearance changed. Its face was that of a human, a girl's face, beautiful but anguished, with full red lips and were drenched with blood. The moment passed, and it was a cat's face again. It let out a weird mewing, leapt on to the window sill, and disappeared through the open window. Quickly Rusty shut the window and examined himself in the mirror. His vest was soaked with blood. For over an hour the cat had been licking and sucking at his fragile skin, wearing it away until the blood oozed out. What happened to you, Rusty? Asked Poppet, now wide awake. Why are you bleeding? He followed Rusty into the bathroom and helped him wash the blood away. It was a cat, exclaimed Rusty, or a vampire. But it had not been bitten. There were no teeth marks, no scratches. The tongue and the constant licking had done the damage. Poppet found a roll of cotton wool in his backpack and used some of it to stop the trickle of blood from Rusty's armpit. Then he dabbed boric powder on the wound and made a rough bandage out of a couple of large handkerchiefs. I didn't know you were a doctor, said Rusty, appreciating Poppet's efforts. I'll get some proper bandages when I'm in the bazaar, said Poppet. But how did the cat get in? It was all part of a dream, I think, said Rusty. A nice dream at first, but then it had changed, and dreams and reality were all mixed up now. Rusty returned to his bed, uncertain about what he had seen. How had the cat's face changed just for a few moments? Had it been a vision, a dream, or the embodiment of a spirit? A bad dream, professed Poppet. Let's just go home tomorrow. If you like, agreed Rusty. But in the clear light of the day, the incident in the night did not seem so terrible. The young wrestler stripped to his shorts, strode out into the sunshine, and went through a number of vigorous exercises. A band of long-tailed langurs watched him from the surrounding trees. A barbet called out from the top of a spruce tree, announcing the imminent arrival of summer. A barking deer peeped out from behind a tree trunk, was startled by the sight of humans, and rushed away. The surroundings were quite heavily wooded, and Rusty felt that there would be larger, fiercer animals lurking in the depths of the forest. Poppet had to visit one of his father's clients, so he left for the bazaar, saying he would be back as soon as possible with bandages and antiseptics. Rusty lazed in the sun, still pondering over the vision of the night before. It had seemed so real, and perhaps it was. I propose we stay here another night, said Rusty. There'll be a lot of walking from tomorrow. Suitably rewarded, the bowler-hatted chowkidar agreed to put them up for another night. Pitambar ate a hearty breakfast, 6 parathas, carrot halwa, and a jug of milk. Rusty hated milk, but he managed to put away 3 parathas with the help of a mug of tea. Not such a bad place at all, said Pitambar, burping with satisfaction. A convoy of crows seemed to agree, for they descended on the area and noisily helped themselves to the remains of the breakfast. Black Hat in the Cemetery. While Poppet went around visiting his father's customers, Rusty and Pitambar strolled through the town, seeing what the place had to offer by way of entertainment and refreshment. As for entertainment, there wasn't any, not even a cinema. Rusty was a nature lover and could spend hours looking for unusual plants or wild flowers, or even butterflies or beetles, but nature's bounty meant little to Pitambar, who was of a practical nature, ever attentive to the needs of his body. He was in fact one of Mother Nature's better specimens, as far as mammals go. However, he was not a reflective person, and could not appreciate his own unique qualities. Beetles could have interested him only if they were edible. As for refreshment, the town was not without its dhabas and small eating places. Pitambar knew from their experiences that such places often provided tastier and more satisfying fare than the smart restaurants and cafes one could find in Dehra and the larger towns. By late afternoon, he had sampled the fare in at least 3 of these. In trying to compete with Pitambar, Rusty had developed acute indigestion. Looking for a place to rest, he spotted an old churchyard and decided to stretch himself out on the steps. Pitambar planted himself down on a large stone slab and then, discovering it was a gravestone, got up in a hurry and joined Rusty on the steps. Is it unlucky to sit on a grave? He asked, for he was of a superstitious nature. I don't think so, said Rusty. The dead could probably do with a little company. The church door was locked and the building looked as though it hadn't been used for years. Daisies and dandelions grew out of cracks in the walls. A portion of the roof was missing. There were about a dozen of old graves in the churchyard, an indication that a small British community had once lived here, for the names inscribed on most of the gravestones were English or Scottish or Welsh or Irish, as far as Rusty could make out. "That cat has been sitting on that particular grave for a long time," observed Pitambar, pointing to a corner of the cemetery where a large black cat lay stretched out on a flat tombstone. "Is it the same one that drank your blood last night?" "Just sunning himself, probably," said Rusty. "It's not the same one." "Black cats are unlucky," said Pitambar. "No, they are lucky," said Rusty. "In Europe and England, every ship keeps a cat on board just for luck, and it's always a black cat. But witches keep them too, I have heard." While Pitambar and Rusty were arguing about cats, lucky or otherwise, this particular cat vanished, to be replaced by a black hat, or rather the black-hatted person who ran the rest house. "Do you think he turns into a cat?" whispered Pitambar in awe. "Of course not," said Rusty. "That cat ran away as soon as it saw him." The boys approached Black Hat and asked him if he looked after the cemetery. He nodded gravely. "I do. It is a duty to the Mem Sahib who is buried here," he said, indicating the tombstone where the cat had been resting. "We saw a cat here," said Rusty. "That's right," said Black Hat. "It was Herbert Mem Sahib's cat." Rusty looked at the inscription on the tombstone. Gloria Anna Herbert, born 1860, died 1935. May her soul rest in peace. "She died 16 years ago," calculated Rusty. "That cat must be very old." "That cat died with her," said Black Hat. "They both drowned when crossing the Yamuna in the small boat. There was a sudden flood. The boats capsized. Herbert Ma'am and her cat and the boatman were all swept away. The lady's body was found and buried here, but the cat was never found. Its spirit comes here every day just to lie down beside her." "It looked like a real cat," said Rusty, wondering if Black Hat was trying to fool them. "A ghost cat," said Pitambar, "coming back to be with its mistress, who must have been a witch. Cats everywhere. Very unlucky. It's time to go home." "We'll decide tomorrow," said Rusty. Dinner by moonlight. Black Hat lit a wonderful bonfire that night. Fallen oak leaves, pine cones, and branches that had fallen during the heavy winter snow all combined to make a crackling fire. The flames leapt up, casting an orange-gold glow on the faces of the boys. Black Hat's demonic countenance was given an even more devilish tinge by the flickering firelight. Eager to keep the fire going, he very nearly set fire to his bird. "Why don't you remove your hat?" asked Rusty. "That hat won't like it," said the wearer. "It feels safe upon my head, and I feel safe beneath it. Rain or snow, outdoors or in bed, this hat remains upon my head." The boys clapped. They had to admire their host's loyalty to his hat, but they had to admit it seemed to suit him, adding distinction to his scar and one eye. "Tell us your name," asked Popat. "Kali Topi is my name. I need no further claim to fame." "We'll call you Topi for short," said Rusty. "But tell us, how long have you been wearing it?" "Only 30 years, about half my life." "It has lasted well," observed Pitambar. "Made in London. It was worn by an Angrezi magistrate when I was a forest officer. He was killed by a tiger. The tiger ate him but left the hat." "Were you there when it happened?" "Yes, it happened very quickly. The magistrate, his assistant, and 2 forest guards, I was one of them, were on foot on the trail down to Hanor when this tiger came out of the bushes, very fast, very silent, and pounced upon the Sahib and carried him off." "And what about you?" "Oh, I was up a tree in no time, but not before the tiger had clawed out one of my eyes. That was when I was trying to rescue the Sahib. None of us had guns, you see. You don't chase an angry tiger with a walking stick. So we waited until we thought it was safe, and then we went for help. Found the magistrate Saab next day. Not much was left of him. It was a man-eater, all right, and the first in these parts, and there were cubs, and they too grew up to be man-eaters. And the hat? Asked Rusty. Was the magistrate still wearing it? No, it was lying near the bushes where he had been attacked. Look, there is still a big scratch on it, made by one of the tiger's claws. The boys came closer to look at it. Its wearer had no intention of removing it, so they had to stand around him to examine it. There was a big dent on one side. It could have been made by any sharp object. It sounded like a very tall story, but the boys decided to believe it. You could believe anything about Black Hat. The dinner was a success. It had been paid for by Poppet, who was in funds after having made rounds of his father's client. He also gave Rusty's arm a fresh dressing and bandage. While they ate, various hungry animals gathered around them in the dark but kept to the shadows. The beasts were afraid of the fire, afraid of the humans, afraid of Black Hat. The caretaker kept the boys awake with tales of treasure, witchcraft, and strange happenings on Witch Mountain. There is a magic stone hidden up there, he said, a rare jade, an emerald brought from Tibet, China, by an early traveler. Find it, and you will be made for life. Rusty and his friends hadn't come on a treasure hunt, but if there was a treasure to be found, why not look for it? Dogs barked and jackals howled. A hyena broke into hideous laughter. An owl, disturbed in a treetop, screeched at all of them. Every now and then Black Hat would throw a chapati or a bone into the dark, and the dogs would fight over it. The jackals waited their turn. The hyena was favored with a meaty bone of mutton. It appeared to have a special relationship with Black Hat. It waited patiently, laughing now and then, confident that some tidbit would come its way. The jackals would come for the leftover once the feast was over. If there were any cats around, they stayed out of sight. It was past midnight when the boys went to bed, too tired to dream, too tired to hear someone or something scratching at the window. But there was something at the window again that night. Possibly human, possibly subhuman, possibly beyond human, and it gazed for some time upon the sleeping boys, leaving the imprint of an ageless face upon the window pane.